I say this to people, conscience becomes a fierce pursuer. People who have lived that life, unless you are a complete total psychopath, which I mean, I'm not an expert, but I believe a very, very small percentage of people actually are. Unless you're a complete psychopath, you go away from these acts and you do feel bad and you do feel guilty, and it's sort of like, I look on it as a form of self-harm. You know, you're in so much pain when you're actually committing these acts yourself, because these acts are acts of desperation.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. So today we're meeting with Ray Bishop. Ray is the author of Outlaw, which is a book based on his experiences growing up in a council estate in southeast London. He and his friends were regularly involved with the police, and Ray tells all about his early days of petty crime. He was dispatched to notoriously violent youth detention centres, where he was further criminalized, and he graduated with flying colours to a career in London's underworld as an armed robber, a drug smuggler and a people trafficker. And along the way he developed a serious addiction to cocaine and heroin, which he'll tell us all about in a minute. But Ray also gives us a story of his struggle and redemption, of coming back from rock bottom and learning lessons the hard way. He enrolled in a rigorous rehabilitation program. In fact, he did that several times, and he managed to turn his life around. He went on to realise his childhood dream of becoming a successful British Boxing Champion, and he set up his own business, and along the way he's also been advocating for others. So welcome, Ray. Good to meet you here.
Lovely to see you again, David. Thank you for having me on.
Great to meet you, Ray.
You too, Naomi.
Really pleased that you've come on. Thank you. And you've
Pleasure.
had such a rich, colourful life, but I wondered if you could begin with giving us a little bit of an account of your early life, where you grew up. Tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I grew up in Woolwich, southeast London, which on the outskirts of the south of London. I would never down talk my area, you know, of my experience. Some great people come from there, but it was an area of, I would call, economic deprivation. It wasn't a rich borough of London. It was just a series of housing estates, basically, and I grew up on one of them housing estates in like the 70s. Really, I'm a product of the 70s and 80s, so yeah, quite challenging times. Yeah.
So in your book Outlaw, which of course you talk about some of that upbringing, you come across as being very reflective about yourself as a young person. Can you say a bit here about how you think you were as a young man?
Well, you know, I've looked at this long and hard, and being an author and like having had the process of writing my own book, I look back retrospectively a lot of my childhood, and from doing therapy and whatever else. But you know, I was never a tough child. I was never a hard child. You know, I was a bullied child. You know, I had quite big ears when I was a kid, and kids can be so cruel, and I was bullied. And I was also bullied because my father was sadly someone who suffered from alcoholism. My mother was an Irish immigrant. I had 4 siblings. We never had a lot. I always felt less than all the other kids, because we just didn't have a lot. And being at the bottom of the pile in the sibling order, you know, I had an older brother and older sisters, so I got my brother's hand-me-downs. I was very much that sort of child. I don't want to play the victim because I know a lot of people didn't have a lot, but I was painfully aware as a child that I didn't have a lot, and especially in the areas of sort of nurture and love. You know, that was sort of non-existent. My dad sadly was quite a violent alcoholic. My mum was quite neurotic. And I remember being hungry a lot as a child. And the first thing I'd done, first sort of criminal thing I ever done, I remember when I was a young child, was I stole a Mars bar from a newsagent's. I'd done that because I was quite hungry, believe it or not. And I'm not playing the poor me, but that was the reality. You know, I was quite hungry. And I remember stealing a Mars bar, and it didn't feel good. I didn't feel that it was the right thing to do. I had a strong moral compass, you know. My mum was an Irish Catholic, and that was a very strict upbringing, and that sort of moral compass was installed in me from a young age. Very strict, authoritarian. If you do wrong, you're going to hell. And I believed that, you know. So I wasn't, you know, I don't believe I was born criminal or with criminal intent. You know, I think... You know, like I say, my first criminal act, I still remember, and it didn't feel good. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. You mentioned that you were bullied. Was that at school, or was that around the estate, or everywhere?
Well, yeah, I mean, at school, around the estate by the older kids. You know, when you grow up in an estate, it's not like growing up in semi-detached houses. I think everyone sort of lives on top of everyone, and I think that can be quite a damaging, toxic environment. I think everyone needs a bit of space, and when you're a kid, I never had that, so I didn't have a place of sanctuary. I shared the room with my brother as well, and my brother was quite... You know, the sort of the toxicity in my family sort of trickled down. You know, the bullied becomes the bully, etc., etc. So my brother was quite harsh and bullying, and I shared a room with him. So I never felt I had a place of sanctuary indoors. And I remember on the estate as a young child feeling immense fear of all the other kids because I didn't have the father guidance, so I never knew what it meant to be a young man. And the other kids that did have fathers or seemed bigger and tougher, I just felt so inferior. I remember them feelings well, just feeling so inferior and disconnected from everyone. And it was, you know, I was full of fear. There was a lot of bullying that went on in my area at that period. You know, there was, for example, I went to a Catholic school that was 2.5 miles from where I lived. And I used to have to walk to school, even when I was from the age of 5 or 6. And there was 2 or 3 other schools that I used to have to pass. And sometimes when you passed these schools, there would be little gangs that would hang about, and they would be from a different estate, and they would go to that school. So you had to take the long way round to school, unless you yourself was in a pack. So sanctuary in numbers became the sort of norm, and I think as I got older, that's how I developed, sort of progressed into sort of like a gang culture, as it were, on the estate, because that's how you felt safe. No different than what we see today.
It's interesting to hear you talking, Ray, because that kind of account is not dissimilar to many accounts that you hear with people who are in prison, and something about how our society's set up that, you know, doesn't give all children the same chance, does it? Most
definitely not. And in my own circumstances, and again, without trying to play the blame game, this is retrospective, the odds were, it was heavily stacked against us, people of my generation, and I tell you why. When I was 14, 15 years old, and we would hang around, because why were we hanging around? Well, because there was no amenities for us. There wasn't a youth centre for us on our estate, and we didn't have money to go places and do things, as it were. And we didn't have, I don't know about playing blame, we didn't have the parents that were taking us on holidays, and so we were just, you know, we hung around the estate. That made us targets for the local police. And this was a tough era, you know. This was Thatcher's Britain, especially when I left school. You know, we was in the cusp of recession. There wasn't a lot of opportunities for people from my estate, and we were all tarred with the same brush, whether we were criminal or not. As far as the police were concerned in our area, and a lot of the people outside of us, we were scum. We were from Woolwich Common. And we suffered a lot of bullying at the hands of the police, and we would get arrested for things we hadn't even done, or I had friends that would plant cannabis on them or something and say, well, if you don't tell us what's going on in the estate, you're getting arrested for it. They had all these tactics back then. It was the old SPG, they were called the Special Patrol Group. They used to patrol our estate, and there would be a van full of police. There would be like 10 police in the van, and they would literally pull on the estate, pull us all over, sometimes give us a punch or something, find it funny. So we were sort of, our options were limited, and I often say this, Margaret Thatcher's way of investing in our future was by building Belmarsh Prison, which was just down the road from where we lived, and the police used to tell us, we can't wait for that to open because you're all going to be in there. And that's pretty much what happened.
That's a very interesting way of putting it, Ray. Thanks for that. I want to ask you about your fascination with guns now, because as I remember it, all young boys certainly were interested in guns, or bows and arrows, or catapults, anything in fact that could be a weapon, or not so much a weapon always, but something which had power in it. And yet, of course, mostly we didn't follow it up beyond making a bow and arrow from a stick and a piece of string, or borrowing somebody's air gun or something like that. Air guns, of course, were totally fascinating. But so how did your interest and fascination for guns develop? What do you think was driving you?
Well, I actually stumbled across guns and firearms almost by accident. What actually happened, we grew up in a military town, Woolwich, which is, don't know if you know Woolwich at all, but it was a series, there was a lot of army barracks in Woolwich. Army barracks, housing estates, and that's pretty much what Woolwich was. Woolwich became quite awash with firearms in the early 90s, and you know where most of them come from? War trophies from the first Gulf War in 1991. In the first Gulf War, 1991, lots of soldiers brought back firearm trophies, deactivated. They would take the firing pin out, they were allowed to bring them back, then they'd get back, the pins would be reinserted and they would be sold. And like Woolwich just become awash with firearms. It's quite a mad thing, really. And also with the building of Disneyland Paris and a lot of the workforce working in Germany, people used to go from our area and work at Disneyland and in Germany, and they used to bring back firearms in their toolboxes, believe it or not. They used to bring back little derringers, which were little little snub-nosed derringers. They were only like this big, and they used to put them in putty and bring them back and sell them because there was a market for them. But so I sort of stumbled across them because they was quite freely available back then. But we had a fascination, I think I had a fascination at a young age with the act of sort of armed robbery. And the reason being is because I came from an area where the people that we looked up to, the older generation, was the people that were robbing the security vans and whatever else, because they used to, I mean, it was criminally, it was the ultimate goal, wasn't it, to do that one job and get that amount of money which would set you up for life, which it never ever did any of them people, and it never would have us. But you sort of aspired to that because you had nothing else to aspire to be. You were caught in the criminal trap, you were tarred that way, you felt that was your lot. Well, I did at the time, and you did, and I aspired to be like them people, but we never were them people. And what actually happened at the back end of 1988, 89, 3 people from our estate got shot by police, 2 all robbing the same security van, 2 got shot dead by the police, and my third friend, as he turned to run to the getaway car, the police shot him in the back. So it was pretty much an execution on the police's part. That's how it was back then. And people think when I say that, they think, oh, you can't say that. Do your research. Douglas Hurd was the Home Secretary at the time, and he ordered the police a shoot-to-kill policy because to bring the armed robbery rate down. So what happened is the more organised armed robbers, they carried on, but the crazy people like us and our little crew, we never progressed to that point because we were desperate and chaotic and but we wasn't organised like them because the police had put a stop to it with their shoot-to-kill policy. But the firearms were, like I say, readily available, and back then, I can only say with hindsight is that they did make you feel empowered. And I hate guns, I hate all weapons, and the message I would ever say to anyone, having been someone who's held firearms and held loaded firearms, you may think you're in control of that gun, but that gun is in control of you. You are not in control of that weapon. It's an extension of self. Hurt people. And I can say this from spending a lot of time in maximum security prisons. And I know one particular friend who shot dead a Securicor van driver whilst committing the act of armed robbery in Manchester. And I said to him, why did you do it? And he had no answer. He didn't set out that day to kill that security guard. He almost said that gun went off by itself. It was just an automatic thing. Because I've been asked this when I've done other media stuff. Would you have shot someone during the act of armed robbery? I would never have set out intentionally to, but I can also say there's no way I could say whether I wouldn't have done with an adult head, and that's why, there's a reason why police officers, military people, they have extensive training before they put these things in their hands. But people on the streets, be it a knife, be it a gun, if you've got a damaged person and they're holding that sort of instrument of death, it's never going to end well, is it? And I can say that, with experience.
Well, it's very interesting what you're saying, because it sounds as if what you're suggesting is that holding a firearm somehow elicits or provokes a kind of psychological process whereby one feels both more powerful and more enabled to exercise power in a particular way.
Yeah.
But that sounds quite primitive. It sounds as if it's almost a primitive level reaction.
Most definitely. And I mean, I look back now and it's some of my deepest shame and why I am quite instrumental in terms of active engagement and rehabilitation. And as you know, I give talks and whatever else on crime, and I'm very mindful of the victims. And at the time I wasn't, because like I say, hurt people, and when you're in that damaged place, you commit these terrible acts, and you have no thought or regard for your victims. It's only looking back now. We were actually quite, really quite menacing at what we'd done, because you become experienced when you commit robbery. I mean, when you get people who run into, say, for example, a bank and shout like you see on the movies, this is a hold-up, this is a robbery, that's actually quite Captain Caveman, quite sort of amateurish. But when you hone your art, it's actually more menacing. And I've heard this in a victim statement when I've been convicted of an armed robbery. And a victim said what was so menacing is he was so polite and so friendly. It's like you don't need to be menacing. If you command enough authority with that weapon, if it's an extension of self, the people are more scared and intimidated that way. Which is not, I'm not making it right, but having known plenty of armed robbers who have done, I've seen the impact it's had on some people. It's pushed victims into alcoholism. I read a statement once where somebody ran into a post office and the teller behind the counter actually wet themselves. It's a horrific dare I say it, disgusting crime. It's something I have deep shame that I perpetrated them acts in the past. It's a disgusting crime.
You're clearly in touch with the impact on victims of experiencing that kind of thing from your account. How do you think you disconnected and switched off from that because I'm assuming you weren't dwelling on those sorts of things as you were carrying out robberies?
Well, I think, like I say, I've had the experience of therapy, etc. But I say this to people: conscience becomes a fierce pursuer. People who have lived that life, unless you are a complete, total psychopath, which I mean, I'm not an expert, but I believe a very, very small percentage of people actually are. Unless you're a complete psychopath, you go away from these acts and you do feel bad and you do feel guilty, and it's sort of like, I look on it as a form of self-harm. You're in so much pain when you're actually committing these acts yourself, because these acts are acts of desperation, whichever way you want to dress it up. At the time we believed we were, in our area, we were the chaps, the faces. We believed that nonsense, but the reality of it was, in my own case and those around me, it was just sheer acts of desperation, what we were doing. And like I say, the best way I can describe it is hurt people. I was hurting, so I will hurt other people, and it becomes a form of self-harm. It's almost like the more violent the crime, the more you can just completely be out of touch with any sort of victim empathy or anything like that, the more you damage yourself. And for me, that propelled me into sort of like drug abuse, as it were, because I got to that place where I was in so much pain that I would numb myself and abuse cocaine or abuse alcohol or opiates, which I only really sort of done in prison because of the numbness, the boredom. It's all part and parcel of that cycle, and you're just caught in it. It's you know there's a better way, but you don't know there's a better way. Does that make sense? It's like I used to think, I reached a point in criminality where I just hoped that one day I would wake up and my life would be different, but I was so heavily immersed in it, and it's just that day was never coming. It's pretty much how it was.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ray. That's a very interesting reflection. So, thinking about the first time you went into a young offenders institute, how did you find that? Did you learn anything from that experience?
Well, I'll say this. And I'm open and honest about this, especially when I speak to young folk. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. The first time I went into a young offenders institution, I was only 16 years old, and I was not much past 16, and I ended up in Feltham, the first place I ended up. And you heard all the rumours, that this is a tough place, and there's all fights, you're going to get this, that, and I wasn't this big tough kid. It was all an act that I'd learned, and masks. But the worst thing that could have happened to me, best thing at the time, but looking back with hindsight, the worst thing is, because I come from an estate and so many people on your estate, when I got into Feltham, I already knew loads of people, or I knew their cousins or their brothers, and because a lot of people from my particular estate had quite formidable reputations, you get the usual stuff when you walk in prison. Where you from, mate? The usual, the old peacock dance, and where you from? I'm from Woolwich Common, and they're sort of like a bit weary then because they don't, and then you sort of get pulled in, and that's how I met, and my criminal circle and expanded, because you get to meet people with different skills, different expertise from different areas, and I sort of got more heavily immersed in the criminal underworld that way. There wasn't prison back then. I mean, I'm going back late, like in the 80s, was again very tough. We'd just come out of the Borstal system, and I just missed it by a year, and we'd gone into the YOIs, Young Offenders Institutes. But that didn't mean the prison officers had changed. You know, they were still the Borstal prison officers with the with the Borstal prison officer mentality. Most of them were ex-army, ex-military, and these were very harsh places for a young person. And I think people like me and a lot of other fellas that I know from that era, it actually quite damaged us. It quite damaged us. We'd already come from broken, unloving homes, and to be put into such a harsh, oppressive environment, I think I can only say for me, it damaged me and hardened me, and I still carry scars from it today, I feel, from spending quite a long periods of my young life in them sort of environments. Yeah. I mean, there was no care. I mean, I suffered from terrible anxiety and panic attacks when I was 16, 17, and I never knew what they were. And I think it's because when I left home, I had absolutely no direction. I wasn't heavily immersed in the criminal world at this time. I was sort of doing petty crime where intervention would have been perhaps possible. But I suffered from terrible anxiety and panic attacks. And I remember being in Feltham Young Offenders Institution as a young man and getting panic attacks and not knowing what they were, but not knowing who to talk to, what to do. And I remember saying to a prison officer once, I didn't want to come out of my cell. I was getting like agoraphobic, and he forced me out of the cell. He said, "Come on, you've got to get out, or you're nick, whatever." Just total. No compassion, no nothing. You know, it was just a brutal, harsh regime. You know, and that's how it was. Very, very different to how it is today. You know, but that hardened me, and it hardened me in my resolve against prison authority, police, judges. You know, I was very attuned as a young man at the injustice of it all. I felt like society was really against me, and in some senses it was, because we saw what went on. We witnessed police corruption. We witnessed corruption in the judiciary from a young age. You know, we were young, naive, but we weren't stupid, and we witnessed these things. You know, it's like I say it in my book, when the police used to stitch us up for things, or used to beat us up for no reason or whatever. You know, who were you going to complain to? The police? Do you see what I'm saying? It's we had nowhere to turn bar ourselves, and that hardened that criminal code. And if you harden the criminal code in someone, you push them deeper into the underworld and deeper into gangland. And that's how it was for me. And then you're expected to behave in a certain way, whether you're that way or not. And the violent crimes I'd done, you know, dare I say it, and people who look at my life and my criminal record will go, "Oh, you're a horrible, terrible, violent man." No, I wasn't. I'd done terrible, horrible, violent things, but I was not a horrible, violent person. I was just so lost, so entrenched in that criminal world, that I behaved in a way that I believed was expected of me. And I can only say that today, now, years later, being a model member of society, a successful businessman, someone who contributes, someone who does a lot for charity, and I don't sing from the rooftops about it. I'm actually quite a, dare I say it without trying to sound, I'm a bit of a philanthropist. The greatest money I spend is the money I give to good causes, and I do that a lot, and I love doing it. You know, I sponsor some boxing clubs for young kids, and I give to animal charities, and I love doing that stuff. And so if you see me today and you look at me there and say, well, where's the transition? You're either horrible, innate, violent, psychopathic, or you're not. So for me, there's two totally ends of the pole. But you know, that side of my life has very much left me. So I don't believe I was ever that way. I just behaved that way. You know.
Thanks for that, Ray. That's very helpful, because it seems to me that what you're saying, well, you've said a lot there, but several of the things you've said is that you came out of those YOIs with a lot more contacts and a much more familiarisation with that kind of outlaw system.
And very bitter. Very bitter.
And bitter.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the other thing I was going to say was, I think in some ways you're talking about the other meaning of the word outlaw, which perhaps is to do with being outside of the protective and caring functions of a social world.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, were you in contact with your siblings at this time? By this time, did you have much contact with them?
The irony was, my siblings are all law-abiding straight people, as is my mother, as was my father, although he died young from alcoholism. They were law-abiding people, they were law-abiding people. My problem was, at a young age, I fell into the estate, and my peers became very much my family. That's where I felt accepted. That's where I felt I could communicate to a degree, and I couldn't tell people how I felt, but I could sure as hell show them. And in the gang sort of way of life, you could do that without sort of fear of reprisal or anything like that, in the sense of if I got caught doing something criminally at home when I was young, I would have got whooped for it, like that's how it was. And so I just felt propelled to I felt like an alien in my own family. I felt like I'd been dropped from a spaceship. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I didn't feel at home. I didn't feel it was a place of sanctuary. I explained that I didn't even feel I had a place of sanctuary in my own bedroom at night time, because my brother was quite bullying. He was older than me, 2 years older than me. So I never had any sanctuary at home. So I sort of left home mentally. I'd left home at a very young age, but I actually left home at 16. But apathy had kicked in long before.
Are you in touch with any of them now?
I am. I wouldn't say I'm close to any of my family, which is quite sad. I am my own children, and I do speak to my family, of course I do, and I love them. And my mum, I love my mum, but I find my mum very difficult. There's a lot of scars there from childhood, where my mum was very unloving and very cold, so there's a lot of scars there still. So I don't feel like, even now as an adult of 50 years of age, if I was ever in real trouble in life, it's not somewhere I feel like I could turn for emotional support or anything like that. I do feel, and I've always felt, quite alone in the world, like quite alone, and I think from a young age, I felt like you have to rely on yourself, and that's real. It's quite sad when looking back, that as a young man, when I was going through all these problems, when I was getting involved in crime, when I was suffering from, I would say, mental illness, because I was suffering from chronic anxiety and panic attacks, which is a clear depressive illness, that I had absolutely nowhere to turn with it, and all I'd done was just act out and became the way I was,
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Ray. I think it is very sad, and I have to say I found a lot of your book was quite sad. It's written in a very kind of dynamic and racy style, but of course a lot of it is tragic.
There's a lot. There's so much I couldn't go into depth about, especially being a child, because I looked at a lot of that stuff in therapy, but I had a very sad, lonely childhood without going into too much depth. I felt very sad, very alone, and to in a nutshell, I used to sometimes watch telly from behind the settee. I used to hide behind the settee and look out, because I was, my stepdad was quite aggressive towards me, and my mum was quite unloving, and it was just fear in my household. It was just, it was a horrible, not a nice, loving, kind childhood, to put it bluntly.
Which probably does connect with the next thing I'd like to talk about, because in your book you clearly seem to link crime with your drug taking, and you've really struggled with this over the years, and the book is graphically honest about the struggles that you had, the relapses that you had, and then how you got back onto your feet again. And it's quite painful reading it. Can you tell us a bit about your drug taking and how you've coped with it?
Well, I've been clean now for a number of years. I mean, I'm nearly 9 years clean of all substances. I don't drink, don't touch drugs, anything. But like I say, at a young age, I mean, it was the acid house era, wasn't it? When I was like 18, 19, it was acid house, like 1988 or whatever. And we experimented. You know, we used to cannabis and ecstasy and whatever else. But from a young age, drugs didn't agree with me. They sort of made me a little bit, how do I say it? Well, suffering from anxiety and depression, you know, they're not a good cocktail first and foremost. And I abused drugs because it was a form of sort of self-medicating. I know that now. That's why I was abusing drugs, and I look at drugs and drug abuse for me as a form of slow suicide. It's almost like you're committing suicide one pill at a time, one fix at a time, or whatever. And a lot of my drug abuse actually stemmed from prison, and a lot of the prison I'd done. Like, I mean, I spent many years in prison. And we would abuse drugs in prison because there was nothing else to do. It was just sheer boredom, and at the time, availability. Drugs used to be freely available in prison, you know. And I abused drugs, especially the sort of opiates and things like that. I abused them in prison, you know. And when I would get out of prison, I would use the recreational substances, because even when you've done, say when we committed criminal acts and we had what we would call a touch, and you get a big lump of money, you always had this vision that if you got a big lump of money, let's say for example £10,000, I'm going to use that money to sort my life out. But you never do. What you do is you end up going off and going to pubs, drinking, having well feathered meaning friends or whatever that never buy a drink. You sort of lap that up because you're getting a bit of attention, and you end up having cocaine and everything else. That's how it was. It was a cultural thing for me in my area. You know, drugs again, like they were just so freely available, and it was just the norm. Everyone done it, or at least everyone in my circle did. You know, I didn't give it a lot of thought until it started causing me immense problems in life. Can I just shut this door? Because there's someone at the door. My two little Shih Tzus are going mad. Sorry. I've got to shut this door. Oh. Apologies. Yeah, and yeah, like I say, it just became the norm. But then for me, I started to develop psychological problems as a result. They was already there anyway, but you know, the drugs only ever amplified that, you know. And I think, especially depending on your personality type, on my own personality type, when I took things like cocaine and things like that, they made me psychotic. With hindsight, I can say that, you know, I became very volatile, very dangerous when I took these substances. But you still felt powerless, and you still continue to do so, you know. Yeah, never a good cocktail.
No, I mean, I think in your book you describe how you began to feel all-powerful, omnipotent, that you knew best and you could work your way through anything through drugs, which must be a very powerful sort of feeling to have. How did you manage to lose the habit of doing that?
Well, to start to grow up emotionally, and for me that was the therapeutic journey that I was privileged to do. That was the start of it. But to grow up emotionally, you know, drugs and drug abuse is very much a head thing. There's a reason why people say I want to get out of my head. because it's the crazy head. That's what we're trying to numb when we abuse drugs. And you also have heard the term with drugs, I've got to get a fix. Well, what is it we're trying to fix? You know, when I explain it like this, it was like a massive hole in the soul for me. Remember I said from a young age, I felt lonely, frightened, afraid. So I chose to live life in my head, and any emotions that came up, I wasn't prepared to deal with them, wasn't prepared to look at them, and it's just numb them out. And people that do that tend to go psychotic and behave psychopathically because you're just so out of touch with your own emotional world. And I think for me, the acknowledgement of the emotional world and to learn and grow with that stuff has took away from me the need to get out of my head. So I choose not to, even if I could today. I would rather go through life feeling than thinking, because thinking is just the path to destruction for people like me. But to go through a world with some sort of emotional, to feel my way through the world, as it were, it's been for me the best thing, because I've found, and I continue to find, the person I always wanted to be, which is quite a nice, kind, caring, compassionate person, and most importantly, I can say hand on heart, someone who has immense empathy today. Immense empathy. I couldn't do the things today that I used to do. And I look back at some of the things I've done, and I sort of, it's almost like I think, who was it? Who was it? Who was that person? I say in my book, don't I? I say that I felt like at times I was possessed by an evil spirit. It's like I would do things and afterwards go, why did I do that? Or how did I do that? Or think I didn't even know I was capable of doing that. That's how bad the compulsion and propulsion system in someone living in that way can be, And they say, don't they, like you can't kid a kidder. And the one person, like fellow cons can't kid fellow cons, and I've spent a lot of time in high security estates and with a lot of people that have committed acts of murder and whatever else. And if you read about these people, you would think, but when you actually get to know them and see them, I wasn't that dissimilar from them. Just for them, it came out in the act of murder. For me, it came out in the act of repeat offending. And repeat violent offending as well, and it's sad, sad. Yeah.
Thank you, Ray. Can I ask you about your boxing? Because you had a boxing career.
Well,
let me finish what I'm going to say. There's actually a 13 or 14 minute clip of you boxing on YouTube. I don't know if you're aware of it. I think it was in 2013, and it seemed like a very tough way to spend your life, Ray, particularly at that time, because you weren't a young man, were you? So how did you manage to look after your body and be what must have been a sort of elite athlete whilst you led such an unhealthy lifestyle?
Well, what happened is when I did get out of prison in 2007, it was, so I'd got out after many years inside. I used to box when I was young. I boxed at school. I went to a place called St. Peter's, which had an amateur boxing academy, and I loved my boxing, and I loved the disciplined, regimented lifestyle. And when I got out, I just started to train again, do a bit of boxing training. And then I got involved in a boxing club, and one thing led to another. And then I started to box again on what was called the unlicensed circuit, because I couldn't get a boxing licence because of my criminal record. But I started to box on the unlicensed circuit, and I became quite good at it, and I loved it. And I stayed clean through that period and whatever else. I think for me it became a bit of a substitute sort of addiction, as it were, because I was living clean at the time. Like, I wasn't using drugs, I wasn't drinking, I was just going to training. I'd go to work, come back, train, and I boxed on the unlicensed circuit and won like their version of the British title, and Yeah, I loved that lifestyle at the time, but that's going back quite a bit now, and I boxed on and off again there for about 4 or 5 years and had quite a few competitive bouts. Yeah, I loved it, but it filled a hole, but it didn't address the issues, if that makes sense. I still had a lot more work to do internally and emotionally.
Yeah, it's interesting that you liken it to an addiction, because it does seem as though maybe the excitement, risk-taking, danger being present there through quite a lot of your life, and boxing perhaps was a legitimate way to achieve that. But there's quite a strong association between boxing and violent crime, isn't there? So a significant number of former boxers have killed their partners, for example. Do you think boxing, in some people's case, boxing hardens people in a way that makes crime more likely, or do you think that generally people who box might have also faced more childhood adversity and trauma than the average person? Are they more likely to fall into your kind of history than have a nice happy childhood and then box?
Well,
and then,
historically you could say that, couldn't you? Because I mean, boxing, in my experience, tends to be like more sort of inner city sport, doesn't it? Most people that get involved tend to come from the tougher communities, but in my own sort of experience and seeing the work it actually does in communities, it teaches discipline, camaraderie. I mean, the boxing clubs, especially the couple that I'm still involved with, they do fantastic work with the young kids, especially I sponsor one boxing club. It's for the charity Change Your Knife, Put Down Your Knife, which is an anti-knife charity, and they don't even charge the children to come in and train off the street. So kids that are economically and socially deprived, they're going in there now and they're getting a bit of guidance, and if they're good boxing coaches, which at this particular gym they are fantastic coaches, they're actually steering these kids into further education, college and employment and training and all these sorts of things. And you've got to ask yourself, is that a bad thing? I think in my own experience, knowing a lot of boxers, and boxers tend to be the least violent people. And although you could say, well, some ex-boxers have killed their partners, or so have IT technicians, so have solicitors and all sorts, and police officers, and in all sorts of professions, that stuff goes on. I think that boxing is very much, I very much fall into the sport aspect, but I'm around the whole the psychology of it, the mental side of boxing, and I think it teaches discipline and self-control, very much so.
Mike Tyson talks about boxers being trained for a kind of war, that need to psych yourself up to be able to hit your opponent, and he attributes his use of DMT and cannabis as an attempt to soften himself post boxing. How have you? Is that something that you can connect with? That idea that you might have to harden yourself to box, or did you manage that differently?
For me, it just came quite natural. I think I mean I was never, although you could look at the crimes I committed in the past and say, well, you must have been quite aggressive or passive aggressive. I don't believe I was, and even in boxing, for me it was more like a game of chess, and it was about the skill aspect, and it's about the art of boxing is to hit and not be hit. I didn't like getting hit, so I'd be quite evasive, and I liked the whole skill of it, pitting your wits against another man in that way. It's sort of like the ultimate game of chess. But they call a boxing ring, it's a very lonely sport, so I think it played into that side of me too. Boxers do tend to be quite lonely people, and have difficulties with personal relationships and things like that. A boxing ring is a very lonely place. It's just you and someone else pitting your sort of wits, and in some senses I suppose risking your life as well. You are risking your life when you step in a boxing ring. People do die, and you can have some, you're getting your brain bashed about it, it's.
Well, I think that's a very good point, because there are estimates that kind of like 85% of boxers end up with brain damage, don't they, or early dementia as a consequence of boxing. do you think the sporting industry does enough to protect boxers and to support them post-industry?
Certainly do not. I mean, post. I mean, in terms of boxers that have actually retired, no. Because I'm actively involved in a lot of groups with ex-boxers and whatever else, and a hell of a lot of ex-boxers. I mean, there's a massive link between ex-boxers and drug abuse and alcoholism and things like that. Massive. I mean, it's frightening how many ex-boxers end up alcoholic or in drug addiction. That's really frightening. But and where you say about the sort of the brain injuries and all that long term, there's a hell of a lot of boxers out there that once they come out of boxing, they can't even get a career or anything because they are damaged from it. Slur their words and all sorts. It is. I mean, it's got a lot safer in today's world, but when I was young, you know, we didn't wear headgear or anything like that. Now it's a lot safer. They wear bigger gloves and whatever else. The medical fraternity is a lot more professional towards boxing today as well. You know, people have brain scans if you're a licensed boxer and regular medicals, etc. But none of that used to exist, did it? So, and on the unlicensed circuit where I boxed, I mean, we were very vulnerable because we didn't have that same protection, you know, with the brain scans and things like that. And I think it damaged me slightly from because I had 30 odd fights, but it was the heavy sparring. Because you see the people have the fights, but for every fight you might have sparred 200 or 300 rounds in a gym with no protection, and you know, so yeah, I think it did damage me slightly. I do get I struggle a bit with my memory sometimes now. I don't know if that's from the boxing or I say the wrong word to things sometimes. Like I call a shop a different name, and I think that's a little bit of boxing, yeah. Or drug abuse, one of the two.
Well, you highlighted that connection in terms of drug abuse and alcohol, and that's not unique to boxing either, is it?
No.
Elite athletes, when they retire, struggle with that transition into retirement and going from having a lot of very positive attention and all the thrill and excitement of whatever sport they are, but in boxing it's very much focused on that one person rather than a team sport where you share that. And I wondered how you were coping with that, because obviously you've had quite a lot of excitement in your life,
yeah.
And then now you've retired from boxing in terms of actively doing that. So how are you getting your excitement now? How do you cope and not end up
I'm still
feeling lost without that?
I'm still quite involved with it. I actually go once a week and do a little bit of personal training still with a professional boxing coach, and I do a bit with him, so I still feel like I'm doing something, and I get involved. I go to a lot of boxing shows and stuff like that. But I think for me, because I'm in business, you know, and I've found sort of my vocation in business, and I've actually become quite successful in what I do. You know, I own and run my own scaffold company, and I've really over the last 5 years gone from strength to strength with it, and it takes up most of my time, you know, and I find that I don't really have much time to do a lot else nowadays. I work a lot, and I think that sort of filled that void, as it were. It's almost like there's a desire in me, because I messed up so much in my life, especially the first half, to sort of like try and make something of the second half. And I've sort of matured, perhaps too late, but I've matured now to a place where I'm sort of thinking long term as opposed to short term. You know, I'm 50 now, and I'm thinking, you know, what have I got? 15 years left, perhaps, of working or whatever, and I want to amass a little something for retirement or whatever. And I'm thinking long term, which is the ultimate sign of maturity in me, because I never felt like that, never thought like that, and I don't believe anyone criminally ever did think about the future. You live very much for the here and now. Everything's about instant gratification, and you don't worry about tomorrow. You don't save. You just, whatever you get, you think, well, I'll do the, you know, they say that easy come, easy go. It's, you get one lot of money, you think, well, once that's gone, I'll do something else. It's just, you really do live in that crazy immature way where you're never thinking about the future. You're never thinking long term. Whereas today I am.
Sounds like you might be getting some excitement out of entrepreneurship as well. You know, the fact that you've built a successful business that that feels like an achievement?
Well, that and my writing, you know, the fact that I discovered I could write, and I've had a book published, and I've written another one, and you know, that's fantastic. You know, the act of writing a book.
Absolutely.
I know that I think you've wrote one. I know David has. It's, for me, it was very cathartic, and I sort of completely lost myself when I wrote my autobiography. I loved it because I wrote that book myself, you know, and I love it. You know, I wish I had more time to do it, but it doesn't pay the bills. You know, I'm not a J.K. Rowling. If it paid the bills, I would do it full time, and I'd really find my vocation. But I have to work, and you know, I do that in my spare time, and yeah, I mean, it really, really does. Work very much has filled a void in me because I've wasted a lot of my life not working. You know, yeah.
You've given us a lot already, Ray, but I want a bit more, if I may. You've talked about maturing. The way you put it was maturing later than you might have wanted to.
Yeah.
But I think in your book you describe very powerfully how, for you, recovery wasn't a one-off thing. It was something you had to kind of get back into time and time again, actually. Yeah. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that journey. What started things to change for you?
Well, I think what really started things to change for me, obviously when I received that long sentence, but for me very much so, the journey began for me in 2003, right, when I made the decision to go to Grendon and do some, actually look at myself. And I think that's very much how the journey started for me. You know, I didn't get it sort of first time. There's been peaks and troughs, and it's almost like I had to make the mistakes to realise, to sort of like, for the things I learned to kick in, as it were. So when I came out of Grendon, you know, I thought I had it cracked, and I made a few mistakes along the way, but it was only through making them mistakes I think I hit another level of sort of self-awareness and sort of recognised that some things, there's factors out of your control. If you don't work it out, you'll act it out. Does that make sense? And I really had to sort of, my mindset sort of changed, so I became quite introspective. So now I know when I don't feel right, there's something going on, and I don't have to act out. I can work through it or communicate with people. And for me, I've had, you know, I don't attribute none of my rehabilitation to my thinking or personal willpower or anything like that. I attribute to the fact I've had some great teachers along the way and some great support once I became open-minded and receptive to that. And I've made mistakes, but I've learned that, you know, that you have to reach out. No one's an island. You can get support in the strangest of places, and that's how it's came for me, you know. And I've had some fantastic support along the way, and learned a lot of valuable lessons, you know.
So it sounds like you've got a really healthy attitude towards mistakes, though, because I think people can often end up feeling quite flawed, can't they? You know,
yeah.
Literally knocked over by it, and then feel like, what's the point in continuing? Whereas it sounds like you decided to make lemonade out of lemons,
yeah.
and take the learning out of the situation so that you could be stronger next time.
Well, I wouldn't want anyone to make some of the mistakes I've made, because in my own instances, some of them mistakes have proved nearly fatal, and or could have ended up a lot worse for others. Like, you know, but yeah, I mean, I've learned the hard way. You know, the real sort of hard, painful lessons. You know. Yeah, and I continue to learn, like we all do. Yeah.
So we've been introduced to your Shih Tzu. Have you got one or two?
Two. My babies. I've got mother and son. Yeah.
Brilliant.
They're my world. I adore my dogs, and I've always loved animals. I'm just a big softy like that with animals. I don't know. So sometimes I think some people see how I am with my little dogs and they think I'm like the Bond villain with a little cat. Like every psychopath tends to have a small little cuddly dog, don't they? But yeah, I've got 2 little Shih Tzus. One's got ribbons in her hair. I love them. I love them to bits. They're my world. And I think animals for me, because I share my yard with an animal charity. And I'm really actively involved in that. And I think animals have taught me a hell of a lot about myself, and that getting in touch with that soft, kind, nurturous place in me and whatever else. I speak about it in my book with my budgie that I had in Grendon. I had a budgie Rigar in Grendon for 2 years while I was there, and I really loved that budgie, and I learned to adore him. And when I left Grendon and I went to another prison, I wasn't going anywhere unless I took my budgie with me. I would, and I took my budgie with me, and he died not long after I got out of prison, and I buried him in a pot, and he was yellow, so I put yellow flowers in there, and it grew to these yellow flowers. So there's a lot of significance to me with animals, and I feel a deep connection and bond with them, and I'm very good with animals. I love them, I adore them. If I had in my ideal world, I would work with animals. If I could make a living out of it, I'd love to. I love animals.
And do you still have contact with Sam, who you speak about very fondly in your book?
Sadly, no. Me and Sam parted ways about 6-7 years ago, and I've been in a healthy relationship with another woman now for over 5 years. I've got a stepdaughter. We've got our own home. We've got a family life. I'm far from perfect, but it's I'm learning about that stuff, relationships, and I think that's where the damage rears its head, especially people who have spent, and I speak to a lot of other prisoners that I'm still in contact with who have spent years in prison, because we're quite lonely, isolated people, and we spent long periods by ourselves. It's quite difficult to feel that contact sometimes with another human being and be intimate per se and make them feel loved and wanted. It's not that we don't love, it's like with my own partner, I love and adore her, but I find it hard to show that. It doesn't come natural for me, it doesn't come easy. It doesn't mean I don't feel it, but the actual expression of it doesn't come easy. I provide for my family very well materialistically, but she often says I'm quite cold, and I don't mean to be. It's just that I don't know no different, and I'm learning that stuff. Still learning, it's But in terms of being, she couldn't feel safer in my company, and like women, children, all that. You look at my past, you would think, cool, who would want to be around someone like me who's lived such a violent, horrible life? But no one could be safer in my company, and that's the truth. And I give that off, and yeah.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, Ray. And I have to say, you're so honest that it's a slightly bittersweet pleasure.
Thank you.
Which I think is a good thing. Now you mentioned you've got another book.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned you've got another book.
Yeah.
Is that coming up for publication? What's happening with that?
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I wrote Outlaw, which is my autobiography, which is always it was never about anything other than to try and carry a slight message of hope, a bit of a redemption story. But the second book I wrote, it's called A Smuggler's Roulette, and it's about the 3 years that I was involved in the smuggling world, because I always knew there was too much to tell in such a short book, because that was really much a defining sort of period in my criminality, as it were. So I wanted to write a book about that, again, not to glamorise crime, far from it, but just to tell the story, a bit of a social narrative. There's a lot of information in there that people wouldn't, unless you was involved in that world, you wouldn't understand. So I thought I would get that out there, and I was just writing it as a little project. But what happened is I wrote the first 10 chapters, and somebody, a proofreader from Virgin, read it and said, "Oh my God, this book's amazing," and they want it. So it's sort of, when they release it or not, it's up to them, because I'm contractually obliged to Virgin. So we've got to wait and see now, because of this stuff that's going on with potential film or the docudrama about my life. We have to wait now because they wouldn't want to release it and spoil this, and they say, yeah, you're at their mercy. But I've got to finish it. I'm being pressed to finish it. I've still got a few chapters left to go, but again, I'm working. It's trying to, you know yourself as an author, it's hard sometimes to find the time to do these things. It's
We're really grateful to you for giving us so much time today.
No,
it's
a
been
privilege.
really interesting talking to you, and the fact that you've been so candid as well and speak with so much honesty about your experiences. Hopefully you'll come back and talk to us when you've released your next
That's
book.
a pleasure, Naomi, and I know David told me briefly that you've done a lot of great work with offenders, and I respect you for that. And in terms of David, it's my way of repaying my debt, because David was one of the people who's quite instrumental in my own start of my own rehabilitative journey, without going into detail. So yeah, no, it's my way of repaying my debt of gratitude. Always an honour.
Thank you.
And you gave me a mention in your book, which I thought was very kind and generous of you.
Well, had you not have you actually assessed me, if you don't mind me saying, and had you have not progressed me onto a wing, who knows where I would be now. I honestly believe I would have probably ended up in Broadmoor, because that's where I was headed. You know, I was that way in prison. Prior to coming to Grendon, I'd had an outburst in Dovegate, and I regrettably attacked 2 prisoners. And when I was in segregation in Long Lartin, which is a maximum security prison, as you know, psychiatrist that came down to the segregation tapped his pen on the side and said, a signature from me and a signature from him, and you're off to Broadmoor. And that's the reality, and you know, that's what could have happened to me. So thank God it didn't. I'd still be there now.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to the film, and we'll look forward to the next book.
Fingers
Cheers,
crossed.
Ray.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Take care.